think we have to look upon these chapters, especially through 17, as Jesus' last will and testament, if you will. And picture yourself having to speak to someone you know that you are going to die, and you are leaving verbally your last will and testament to a group of your friends or your family. And that's kind of what's happening here. So it's called the Book of Glory because the word glory, kavod in Hebrew, refers to God's manifest presence in the world and God's love for the world. Right? And those ideas will come through very clearly. The death of Jesus is when God's love is most intensely expressed, because his death is an act of love for the world. Okay? Now remember, this is John focusing on Jesus and his mission at the end and so on. Now chapter 13 begins with a sign that we're very familiar, most of us are very familiar with, and that's the washing of the feet of the disciples. And the section begins, and I gave you a list of the quotes that I'll be focusing on today. I know I sent many of you a full text of all of the chapters, but I know for some of you it would be too heavy to schlep around. So we kind of broke it down from 5 pages to 1. But it starts off, now before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. He loved his own who were in the world, and he loved them to the end. All right? And so that's how he opens up chapter 13. Notice he also ties the events of what will happen to the Passover, with everything that entails and so on. And when we get to the crucifixion, one of the things you will notice that for most Christians, we believe that the Last Supper took place Thursday evening into Friday. For John, the Last Supper took place Wednesday evening into Thursday. All right, and we'll explain that, because Wednesday into Thursday is what was known as the day of preparation. It's the day that the lamb was slaughtered. Okay, but we'll get into that. But Jesus now ties himself into that mentality. John concentrates his focus on the purpose and the mission of Jesus. Okay? But interestingly, here at that Last Supper, we have the contrast, the approaching of the darkness. In here, we read that the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. So we have entering here the thought of a demonic power entering into the fray. All right, and we'll see what that means later on. But it's also very interesting that after all was said and done, Jesus says to Judas, all right, go out now and do what you have to do. Judas immediately gets up, and as the scriptures say, he got up and left. It was night. All right, that expression, it was night, is meant to be seen as symbolic of the darkness. All right, it wasn't meant to be time, literally. but it was meant to let people understand that the night had descended, the period of darkness had descended. Okay? So let's take a look at the washing of the disciples' feet. There probably is no need to have any great commentary about this. Okay? Except that it is, again, a sign. And there's a twofold sign here, one on the obvious level and one on a deeper level. The obvious sign of Jesus washing the disciples' feet is the sign of loving service. I want you to do exactly as I am doing. You can't get away from it. All right? But if you remember the situation, when Jesus goes to wash the disciples' feet, Peter protests. Lord, you will never wash my feet. And the Lord kind of says to Peter, if I don't wash you, then you cannot belong to me. So then Peter, in all of his Peterness, basically says, not only my feet, but my head and my hands and so on and so forth. So what is this sign, this deeper sign? It tends to be a sign of redemption. All right? It's a sign that God's love washes over humanity. Peter being the human example here. All right? God's love washes over humanity, and Peter cleansing and purifying him with life. And that is precisely what the idea of redemption is all about, being filled with the life of God. Now, in verse 31 and following of 13, we have a summary of Jesus' ethic, and it's pretty straightforward. We've heard it all the time. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. Now, we have heard this many, many times, but one of the things we don't realize that Jesus is focusing not just on loving one another, but with the emphasis being, as I have loved you. Jesus does not get specific like the synoptic gospels do, spelling out each of the things people have to do. He leaves it with his disciples saying, love as I have loved you. So that means you have to go back and they have to go back and remember all of the things that Jesus had done. Okay. And now putting it in the context of having washed the disciples' feet as a servant, it ties in. This is what servants do. All right? You are a servant of the people. So you do as I have done. And that specifies it. That little word as, right, makes it slightly different than just a general thought of loving. Okay? The core, obviously, of Jesus' message is love one another as he has loved us, but it's not a superficial love. You know, the Gospels say here, you know, no greater love that one has than to lay down his life for his friends. But when Jesus talks about loving as he loved, it ultimately means you ought to love even to the point to be willing to lay down your life for your friend. Okay? Now, I'm sure laying down your life takes on many, many different connotations as we meditate on it. Doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to end up on a cross or whatever. But I think many of us going through the experience of life know what it means to die for someone. All right? To give ourselves totally. And that's the one thing I may not have mentioned at the beginning, but as we're going through these chapters, I think I put it in the email to you, these are chapters to be really meditated on. There's nothing extraordinary here in terms of great events. We'll worry about that when we get to the crucifixion. But these 4 chapters are just beautiful to sit down and meditate on as this man's last will and testament. Chapter 13 also displaces the institution of the Eucharist. John does not have the institution of the Eucharist as we know it. All right? He doesn't have, he takes bread and blesses it and breaks it and says, take this, all of you, and eat it. That's not here. Okay. But what I think John does is he takes that event that people know, and he basically says, if Jesus' body and blood is poured out for us, thus all of us are bound in love in the celebration of the Eucharist. So when we celebrate Eucharist, there is a bond of love that exists, brought about through Christ's giving of his body and blood. Right? Eucharist is not a private me and Jesus type of situation. There are so many positive ramifications here that demand action and understanding. Some see in this a sign of baptism with the water and at the washing of the feet. I'd go a step beyond that and say the washing of the feet in the sense of taking place at where Eucharist is established. Right? The washing of the feet also is a sign that Eucharist speaks to doing service. Okay? That it cannot be some sort of personal piety where the Eucharist just stays with me. Okay? Now, chapter 14, we have Jesus completing the cycle of his life. In the beginning, in the prologue, we hear that the Word was made flesh. And now what we're going to see is that this Word is the first to go back to final communion with God. So he's basically finishing the circle. And let's read what is said here. And you know the way to the place where I am going. And Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way? And Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you know me, you will know my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. Now, I think what's very interesting here, there's a reference back to the I am phrases, and that expression, I am, goes right back to the book of Exodus, where God reveals his name, if you will, to Moses. And very often in the Gospels, Jesus will go back to that motif, the I am phrases. I am the vine. All right? I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. And I think, interestingly enough, doing some reflecting on it, we're talking about, people talk about truth, and Pilate's famous statement, what is truth? I think for Christians, anyway, what we have to realize that faith is not centered in a proposition. Truth is not centered in a proposition. Truth is a person. truth that's very hard for us, I think, to grasp. Okay? But for the Christian, you're looking for the truth. Jesus is the truth. So it means penetrating into what that means. Okay? All right. Now, the second part of that, Philip said to him, Lord, show us the Father, and we will be satisfied. And Jesus said to him, Lord, show us the Father, and we will be satisfied. Jesus said to him, have I been with you all this time, Philip, and you still do not know me? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Do you not believe that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me? So again, Jesus setting the idea that everything is abiding in relationship, Jesus to his Father, to his disciples. All right. Jesus tries to kind of lessen the effect, to calm down and comfort those he's going to leave behind. And I think in a very beautiful passage, he says, do not let your hearts be troubled. And this is one of the things that come across all through the Gospels. Here he says, do not let your hearts be troubled. Other places he says, do not be afraid. Constantly trying to get that across. Do not be afraid. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? So what is happening here is that in trying to lessen the shock, Jesus basically says to his disciples, all of this is like a homecoming. Okay. I prepare a place for you. And it's very interesting that John the 23rd, when he was dying, he came out with a quote, my bags are packed and I'm ready to go. So even John himself understood that he was going home. The circle of life was now going to be completed. Now, most importantly in this whole section is the introduction of I don't want to just say a character, but it is a character, the Paraclete. All right, let's read what he has to say. If you love me, you will keep my commandments, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate. The word advocate in many translations is Paraclete, to be with you forever. This is the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive because it neither sees him nor knows him. You know him because he abides with you and will be in you. Interesting concept, this Paraclete. It is the Spirit of Christ, but it's different. The expression here is different. The common word for spirit in Greek is pneuma, or in Hebrew it's ruach. Here, he's not using that common term. He's using the term Paraclete. Now, what is the role of this Paraclete? Right. To comfort, to encourage, to be a lawyer. It's actually a legal term. It usually refers to a defense lawyer, but in this context, it's the prosecutor. To give courage, to strengthen, and to embolden. This will be the gift to the community, this Spirit, who will in some way offer all of these elements, all of these characteristics to the community. It's Jesus' gift to the community. So the role of the Spirit will help the community to remember and understand what and who Jesus is. It is the Spirit of Jesus who stays with the community. Jump ahead You all know the famous story of Pentecost and the arrival of the Spirit. Well, what actually, as we understand it, takes place with the giving of the Spirit at Pentecost is this moment of enlightenment. That the Spirit comes precisely here, and it helps the disciples to understand what and who they have lived with and everything that he said throughout his life. Okay? They lived with him for 3 years. They didn't understand him. All right? They didn't know exactly who he was. But all of a sudden, this Spirit comes, and all of a sudden, they now become encouraged to go out and preach what they know, because they understand him. All right? Chapter 15, we have a very famous parable here of the vines and the branches. Now, in traditional Judaism, the vines is a typical symbol of Judaism. It refers to Israel, God's vineyard that God takes care of and protects. If you want to see a very interesting scripture quote, read Isaiah chapter 5. It's the song of the vineyard. You don't have it there, but let me read some of it. And I think it's very interesting because it really brings out what prophet is all about. Just listen to carefully what happens between the first set and the second set. Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it. He expected it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. And now, inhabitants of Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I expected it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? And then it goes on. Again, very, very much the idea that God just saw the fact that Israel had not yielded good grapes. But if you listen to those first two sections, the point of what it means to be a prophet comes through. The first section, all right, the language is in the third person. In the second portion, the language is in the first person. All right? This idea that the prophet speaks for God. And here, very subtly, we go from third person to first person. So this idea of the vine and the branches, the vineyard is very important. And Jesus comes out and says, look, I am the vine. My Father is the vine dresser. Okay? And the interesting thing is that if there is no fruit that grows off one of the vines, it's plucked off and thrown away. Those that yield good grapes will be pruned back so that they continue to yield good grapes. And so I think in that, Jesus then goes on to say, I am the vine, you are the branches. All right? You must abide in me. And so that is what Jesus is talking about in terms of the relationship that exists. Apart from him, they have no real life. And that's what he's saying here. Cut the branch away from the vine, there's no life. So Jesus is the vine, you are the branches. Stay with me. All right? And so we have the reaffirmation of the love command. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. No one has greater love than this, that to lay down one's life for one's friends. All right, beautiful comment here. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I do not call you servants any longer, because the servant does not know what the master is doing, but I have called you friends, because I have made known to you everything that I have heard from my Father. One point of caution. He now goes in and he talks about the hatred of the world towards his disciples. And if you remember in the prologue, the world, the cosmos, was shaped according to the pattern of the Word of God. Right? And then, of course, in chapter 3, we have the famous touchdown Jesus quote. All right? John 3:16. You go to these all these events and you see people carrying signs. John 3:16. We call them touchdown Jesus. That's a touchdown Jesus quote. God so loved the world that he gave his only son. Okay? But what we also understand, this cosmos that was created, referring to civilization, is made up of human beings who are quite capable of saying no. And as Jesus tries to explain, all right, they have rejected me, they are going to reject you. So don't have any, rosy-eyed thoughts that you are going to get through this without any problem. Just be aware. Don't be naive. And the final point I want to make is that in chapter 16, Jesus compares his death and separation to the experience of childbearing. When he just heard him say about joy. Well, here's what he says about childbearing. Very truly, I tell you, you will weep and mourn, but the world will rejoice. That's what he's saying. You will have pain, but your pain will turn into joy. When a woman is in labor, she has pain because her hour has come. But when her child is born, she no longer remembers the anguish because of the joy of having brought a human being into the world. So you have pain now, but I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice, and no one will take your joy from you. So those are words, I think, to meditate on. And next time around, we'll continue with chapter 17. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Don. Can you hear me? Come on. Hello, everybody. I want to start by saying that I feel like that this is an amazing time that we actually are dedicating basically the whole lecture for Love Thy Neighbor. This is really what it is. While we're living in a reality in America, in Europe, and the Middle East, that is seen to be, there's an earthquake, and we have to hold on, So, first of all, I want to dedicate our lecture to all those who died in all these months, being the sacrifices that they had to pay in their lives to be close to God that way. When I first started getting ready for today, one of the things that I found the most odd was the verse that Jesus says, this is a new commandment. I'm going to give you a new commandment, right? And sorry about that. I didn't understand what that meant. And only when I finished preparing, I realized what it was. Because love thy neighbor is not a new commandment, right? This is the first thing I thought to myself. This is something that Judaism had it many times, and not only did it have, we had it in our sources. It is considered actually the most important commandment. So why would Jesus say this is a new commandment? I'm sure he knew the sources. So I'll get to that. Why I think it was he meant this was a new commandment, and hopefully Don will agree with that. But basically what I think it wasn't a new commandment, but what it meant was that it is the essence of all the commandments. Okay, so in a sense, it would be in the 11th commandment, right? So if you would have to list the commandments and you would have one more commandment, this is an exercise that I've done many times in many places when they tell you, okay, if you had the choice to choose one more commandment, right, what would that be, right? So in terms of what Jesus is saying, I would choose that commandment to be the 11th commandment, that new commandment. So, of course, as I was going through this, I realized that's exactly what he did. And I'm going to quote from Matthew. It's a book that we studied. It's been 2 years now. So this is if I start quoting from the New Testament, that means I've learned something, right? But in Matthew 19, Jesus actually lists the 10 commandments. It's 19:16. It says, "Then someone came to him and said, 'Teacher, what good deed must I do to have eternal life?' And he said to him, 'Why do you ask me about what is good? There is only one who is good. If you wish to enter into life, keep the commandments.'" Okay, and we know that too, because commandments in Hebrew, mitzvah means to connect. Letzavet. So it connects you with God whenever you do a commandment. He said to him, "Which one? What commandment?" And Jesus said, "You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, honor your father and mother. Also, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." So in a sense, what we have here in the text is that Jesus adds the love thy neighbor as an additional commandment. And that's the only way for me to understand why he would say it's a new commandment. In our sources, in the Jewish sources, the first time we see this commandment is in Leviticus 19:18, when it's in the whole section is called holy. It's when God speaks to Moses and says to him, speak to the people of Israel and tell them, if you want to be holy, this is what you should be doing. Right? So there's different things that are listed, but then it says, you shall not, this is verse 18, you shall not take revenge, and you shall not bear a grudge against the member of your people. You shall love your fellow as yourself. And that's not, there's no period here, right? We quote normally, you shall love thy neighbor, or you shall love your fellow as yourself, and we stop here. But this is actually in the verse, it's not the end. The end of the verse is, I am the Lord. Okay, and that is not less important than that commandment. And why? Why is that as important as the first part of the commandment? Because to say to someone, just like to say, love your brother, love your sister. Okay, parents say that all the time, right? But if the parent would say to the child, if you dislike your brother or sister, you actually dislike me as your parent because I created them too. I brought them here too, right? I brought them up too. So in a sense, this is really has to finish the commandment by saying, I'm the Lord, because the idea is that you love your neighbor not just for your neighbor. You have to see your neighbor, yourself is in your neighbor, of course, but you have to see God in your neighbor as well. And really that is the tricky part. It's if you see someone who is so different from you, what is the connection? I don't see myself in you, right? But God is saying, trust me, I created that person as well. So even though you think you're very different, you have a common denominator. And as a matter of fact, to unify the name of God, our commentator, there's a commentator called Or HaChaim, the light of life, that's his name, for his pseudonyms. But he says that the only way to make God or glorify God as one God, right? The unity of God in this world is by us coming together, the people. So of course, coming together as in the Torah, maybe as Jewish people, but I would definitely expand it, and I think that I'm happy to see that Judaism and Christianity, and actually I looked in other religions a little bit, and it seems like even Islam and other religions see that as the bottom line. That basically you can fulfill all the mitzvot, but the bottom line is to get to a point where you love your neighbor as yourself. So what it means is it's not that you necessarily have to love them in the sense that we think, oh, you have to hang out all day and you love them that way. No. What it means is, and as Don was saying, is to be willing to give that person. And of course, the ultimate giving is to give your life, right? So when you give your life, you're willing to give your life. It's not necessarily for that particular person, but it is for the understanding. For example, if I give from what we today experience, police, military, they're willing to give their lives to defend us, right? They don't know each of us, and they know that they're defending the United States, even though the United States is very polarized in many ways, right? But they're not defending their lives just to defend one person or the other, or one opinion or the other. It's they're defending the institution that everybody will have the freedom to say what they think and do. Right? And this is the most important thing, that you are willing to give your life for the other person so the other person can live. There's a famous quote, I don't remember who said that, but I disagree with you, but I will defend, I'll give my life to, so you can continue to say what you... Voltaire. Okay, Stanley, can you please tell us the whole... Okay, so that really is Voltaire said that, so to maintain the freedom. And actually, it's interesting because even now in France, the same debate is happening, even with these attacks, that they don't want to limit people's freedom for the security's sake. So of course it's a discussion to have. So the glory of God, as we speak about glory of God, The glory of God is when we all we come together. When people come together, this is the glory of God, because the glory is the what we leave behind. So in God's term, God lives in heaven, and His glory is on earth, right? So whatever God's manifestations on earth is, are or is, this is His glory. So for Jesus and for Moses, it's the parallel here. Before they leave, they want to leave us with their last words, right? With their legacy, right? I would even put glory and legacy here together. And what is the legacy? The legacy is, they both say basically the same thing, that you should love your neighbor as yourself. I want to quote something from, actually, before Moses departs, he also, similar to what we read that Jesus said about study. I mean, basically, if you want to fulfill the commandments and you want to glorify God, you have to love thy neighbor. And this is what Moses is saying. He's not specifically saying that this is the commandment, but he's referring to one specific commandment. And there are commentators who think that this commandment that Moses is referring to the love thy neighbor. For this, it's in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 11. For this commandment that I command you today, it is not hidden from you, and it is not distant. It is not in heaven for you to say, who can ascend to heaven for us and take it for us, so that we can listen to it and perform it. Nor is it across the sea for you to say, who can cross the other side of the sea for us and take it for us, so we can listen to it and perform it. Rather, the matter is very near to you, in your mouth and in your heart, to perform it. So this is really the love thy neighbor, love thy fellow, is always an opportunity. You always have opportunities to do that with your friend, and not necessarily because you agree with your friend, right? We live in this right now, in this reality where there will be a lot of disagreements, right? But the point is, can you stretch your heart? And I know that it's very, very, very challenging to see the point in the other person's philosophy. It's very hard. But what Jesus and Moses are telling us that in order to keep God's unity on earth, we have to stretch ourselves, and in our heart to be able to include that somehow. The last thing I want to look at is the advocate. The advocate. So in Israel, when you want to say a lawyer, it's a synonym for lawyer. You say praklit, which now, preparing for this class, I now finally learned what the source of it. Praklit or paraclete is an advocate, and the idea is that if you do the commandments, if you are connected to the commandment, even if you don't think you fulfilled it in a complete way, you're not connected to the vine, right? Because a mitzvah, commandment, is to connect. So you're not connected to the vine in a perfect way. Then, if you just started, God will notice it and send you someone to kind of strengthen you, and will be your what we say in Hebrew, melitz yosher. We look at it on Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur, this is it's a big concept that God is our melitz yosher, is our paraclete, that sees that we at least try, just by virtue of coming to synagogue, right, to pray on that day. That's already a step. It means that we need to repent for something. We have to do something, and God helps us. This is so important that actually yesterday in the synagogue, we read the weekly portion that talks about Aaron's death, and it's in the same incident when Aaron and Moses, when God tells them, give water to the people, they're complaining, there's no water, and instead of talking to the rock, they hit the rock. The only thing is that they didn't just hit the rock, they also accompanied their actions with harsh rhetoric, and they called the people rebels. Some of the commentators say actually this is the reason they didn't enter the land, and they stopped doing what they're doing because at this point they were not defending the people anymore. They're not strengthening the people. So they had to, in a sense, go. It's very sad to think of Moses and Aaron as those branches on the vine that didn't produce fruit anymore. But in a sense, if you want to think about it that way, God had to cut them off from the vine so they don't continue with the rhetoric. So the most important thing is to try, of course. Nobody is perfect, but the rhetoric is very, very important of how you approach things. And of course, we see even in our days now. I'm sorry that I keep going back to it because we live in a difficult situation now. Those people who kill themselves, they think they're doing something holy. But even though in many places they operate on their own, but still they listen. They are influenced by rhetoric around us. So it's very, very important. And we see in the Bible, in the New Testament, that these things are very, very important. The way your approach is very important. And I'll just conclude by looking at the one verse that when Peter said to Jesus, I'm willing to give my life to you, and Jesus said, well, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times, which means that don't think this is an easy, you always have the opportunity, right? Like Moses said, that commandment or that opportunity to give your neighbor and to be with your neighbor is always there. But in Jesus's rhetoric is don't think it's easy, right? Even though it's right here and I'm near you, don't think it's easy. So in a sense, not only is this the one new commandment because everything is boils down to that, all the commandments. And as, of course, Rabbi Akiva says, all this is, or actually the Hillel, the elder said, when somebody came to convert with him, he said, all the most important mitzvah is to love thy neighbor, or actually he said, do not do what is hateful to you, don't do to others, and everything else is commentary. So Jesus, who lived in those, they lived in about the same time, uses the same idea, is that this is the essence of all the mitzvot. So he lists all the 10 commandments and says, okay, this is a new commandment, but also not only that it's new commandment that way, but I'm bringing a new aspect of that commandment. Know that it's very, very hard to fulfill. And even though you are now telling me you will give your life for me, That's not that easy, and you will deny me 3 times very soon. But eventually, we want the world to get there, that you will see yourself in the other. You will see God, of course, in the other, and we will be able to unite God's name and have God's glory on earth by coming together ourselves and unify ourselves. Thank you.
Now he's hoping that I'll agree with him.
So I don't know. That's my student here speaking. So what do you think?
I think to a point, it makes sense. I think, at least from my reading and the context, that when Jesus said, I give you a new commandment, excuse me, he's basically saying the newness here is love as I have loved you. So in other words, he is making himself, all right, the model, all right, and it ties into what Jesus says later on, where he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So he's tying us, if I am the way, then my way is the way I have loved you. All right? Don't deny anything that Gadi said at all, but I think from the point of view of interpreting that expression, I give you a new commandment, it places Jesus as the absolute example of what it is to love your neighbor.
By giving his life?
Well, doing everything that he did up to the point of giving his life, because obviously what John is trying to say is that he and the Father are one, so that there's a divine connection between Jesus and God. So everything kind of flows out of that. One of the examples that what you did at the parasha the other day, the idea that Moses was denied entrance into the promised land. One of the reasons that I kind of heard along the way was that one of the reasons that happened was that Moses did not treat his people as God would have treated them. Okay? And I think what God is saying here, you treat him as I would treat them. And I think to parallel what Jesus was saying, you treat them as I have treated you. So I think that there's a certain parallel there. But I think that the whole idea of as I have loved you and then I am the way and all of that makes the connection that, Jesus is saying this is what's new about it. Not loving one's neighbor, okay, but love the same way, with the same attitude, with the same mindset that I have loved you. I also think, just as to make a comment even on that commandment, very often that commandment comes flying off our lips, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. But as you reflect on it, the way to God starts with yourself. If you look at those 3 elements. Because trying to understand who you are. What is it that you have? What is it about you that would make you equal to your neighbor? Because that's what you're saying. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. So that there's a commonality. There's not always just the difference. There's a commonality. What is the commonality that exists between me and my neighbor? If God loves me as I am in the now, then that's saying that God loves them as they are in the now. All right? Not making distinctions or anything like that. So I think very often when you're trying to live up to that commandment, loving yourself is the hardest thing to come to deal with. Our egos have to be somehow put in place. All right? Because that to me is the key to loving your neighbor and then ultimately to loving God.
And that's why the end of the verse in Leviticus is love thy fellow like yourself. I am God.
Right.
That because what if you don't love yourself? Then you would love your neighbor like you love yourself. That's terrible. So it's, I'm God through, right. So make it love your neighbor like I would love your
Right.
neighbor and create a neighbor. Thank you for the
Corinne?
clarification.
Corinne?
The microphone is coming your way.
Would you comment on the penal system as it exists today in the civilized world, to take a human being and put him in a cell, and sometimes it ends there almost. I don't see where this commandment would work in our society of reprimanding criminals. How are we expressing love in what we do to a human being by putting him in a cell and having somebody else watch over him and sometimes forget?
Well, I think part of the problem here is that, you're dealing with all of the eccentricities of the human condition. I mean, confining someone is one thing, but while that person is confined, what is happening? Are we just confining them for the sake of confining them? All right, that's one way to understand it. The human situation demands a certain structure. And I think what we have to constantly look at is how is this structure reformed or to be reformed? I mean, we in the church go back to Vatican II, and basic line is the church must always be reformed. Well, it's not the only institution that has to be reformed. All right? But you've got to get people talking with one another in some sort of a dialogue in order to reform anything. All right? So, I mean, the penal system, I mean, it's one question, but in the view of Christianity, the idea is always the tension between how do you treat another as a human being, okay? And sometimes treating another as a human being might be to the betterment of the rest of society if he was separated. All right? So it's a crazy discussion.
Yeah, I can just add to it quickly, and I think this is really not so much our place to comment that much on it. I mean, briefly maybe, but I can tell you that personally, I think it's of course cruel to put people behind bars, and I think we should try to limit it as much as possible and try to find other ways to rehabilitate people and bring them back into society. I can tell you that just my father was talking about like how they used to do that in Yemen. And my parents came from Yemen, and we tend to look at these societies as backwards or this, and nobody would want to go and have vacation in Yemen today or move there maybe. But he said they don't incarcerate people, and if they do, they incarcerate them in a very lightly. It's not like they make a whole industry out of incarceration. Actually, because they believe that is the most cruel thing to do, to incarcerate someone. It's interesting, the value system that's and punishment, and
I also think too that you have to ask yourself, how can I or do I love that person? So often it's easy, once you deal with the other as an object, then love can't happen. Because love can only happen between two subjects, not a subject and an object. So I think what the question would be is, how can I, or even at more basic, how do I love that person if I truly believe this is the ethic to live by?
I'd like you to expand, if you will. This is the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it neither sees him nor knows him. That whom the world cannot receive gives me a little pause. Are we incapable of receiving the Spirit of truth? I mean, we're being appointed or being given an advocate because the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive. Why is the world incapable of receiving? I mean, if the commandments are for everybody, then where is this proposal for an advocate?
Because one explanation is that really, unless you are open to the possibility of the Spirit, you can't see it. All right? And what Jesus is saying is that the world has become so hardened of heart that it can't see it.
So is this, in essence, is this where the structure of the hierarchy of the church is established?
I don't want to go in that direction. No, I think what we're dealing with here is the personal Spirit, and again, I've always been taught, and I've always grown up saying, let's face it, folks, I cannot utter a prayer on my own. I can only utter a prayer through the power of the movement of the Spirit. It is the Spirit who prays within me. All right? So the question becomes then, what do I opt to do? And once I opt to move in that direction, the Spirit is there. But there are many who just close themselves off. All right? Just like the Pharaoh. It's very close to the idea of the Pharaoh in Egypt. God hardened his heart. So part of the problem is that we say that people it's not that they can't ultimately see it, but they don't. They somehow harden themselves to the reality. Look at the verbiage that Gadi was saying. Look at the language that we use, which is so hateful. If you continue to use hateful language, you cannot communicate. You have demonized the other side. Once you've demonized something, they are wrong and evil, and the attitude is, what do I do with evil? I try to destroy it. Okay? So once you demonize, you're on the road to destruction. Because they're demonizing you, you're demonizing them. Is there any spirit of truth in the two sides that can bring them together? And somehow that just means listening and probing rather than being so dogmatic.
But that's not to say that there's no demonization in this world. There's no demons in this world. According to what we just read, that the devil went into him.
Right.
And we have, there is, it's not everything is on the same level. There are bad things in the world that we want to remove. It's not like there's nothing. But I think that's why it's a hard commandment, because what you think may be evil may not be, and then things that you think are not evil may be evil. So this is the learning that we have to do. But the direction is to want to love thy neighbor as yourself. But on the way, we'll be tricked a lot.
I think part of the conflict is that we're living in a society where we understand justice in terms of the scales, the famous scales of justice, okay. But that's not biblical justice. It is not the justice of Jesus. All right? And therefore, what is so difficult is that we perceive justice on this balance, and if we're trying to live a biblically oriented life, it's a conflict. Because biblical justice is not an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. All right? Or that the scales have to balance. All right? And that's part of the constant struggle that we're going through.
And that's why I think, and then we'll ask the question, I think that Hillel's, the way Hillel puts it, is brilliant, because he just gives us a little direction, how to even start loving our neighbor the way we love ourselves. Is, he said, whatever you dislike, don't do to others. We know very well what we dislike, so let's start there. And everything else is, commentary.
I think here. Go there.
So?
No, we'll go here.
We'll go here first?
All right. I love you dearly. We'll be back.
I've been itching to ask this of you ever since it occurred to me, and the time has finally arrived. I'm trying to frame this in a way in which it's not political, if I can possibly do that. This is a theological question. This is not a political question, okay? I'm not asking for a political answer. The question is this. We have this thing called the Ted Cruz and his evangelical Christians, let's say, if they are Christian. And Donald Trump made a remark in which he referred to Hillary Clinton's religion, which is Methodist apparently, as a cult. That, in a sense, Ted Cruz has the true religion, and she's practicing some kind of a cult.
So
and that's the question. Would you explain what is an evangelical in relation to a Christian? What does it mean? What is the distinction? And how does that square with it being a Presbyterian or an
Okay, my only concern is that this is not really the place to discuss that. That's all. I mean, I'm myself I'm curious myself to know what exactly the difference. But it's just not and I actually would like to avoid the political discussion, because it's really
I'm not trying to ask a political question. I want to know what evangelical means.
Can you
in relation
answer
to
that
Christianity? What is the difference?
Well, basically it's evangelical is it's a mode of expression of a particular denominational or sectarian view. It's on the emotional level. It's very biblical. Okay, Methodists or Catholics or Presbyterians, they belong to what they call the mainstream, And when any of our politicians finally decide to understand what they talk about. That includes the media, the politicians, all right? They know next to nothing about what they're talking about when it comes to religion. And that's the sad part. They get these bits and pieces, and here we're talking about rhetoric before. How can I slam this person? To me, the question itself is just based in ignorance. And we'll leave it at that.
And I will just give one, because I think you deserve some answer, of course, and I think it's, because you want to know also. I really, also, the title is, to me, is not important. Because it doesn't matter what you are, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, it doesn't matter. Because, and it doesn't matter so much what the scripture is saying, it's how you live it. Because if I would live by this, I would have to stone women. I would have to do a lot of things that we don't do. So we don't take it literally. We take it seriously. This is the way we live. So it doesn't matter under what umbrella. I think you always have the opportunity to do good, or of course not good within your group.
The evangelical church is one wherein the members are to dedicate themselves to going out into the world and spreading the gospel. That's it.
Yeah. So you can do it in a good way. You can do it in a negative way, and like anything else. So, yeah.
All right, Jack.
The point that you brought up about the advocate or the paraclete, I would look at that as a two-way street. And I think, Don, you mentioned prayer.
Right.
Okay. We get the Spirit at confirmation or at Pentecost, but the two-way street is in prayer, where you need the Spirit to chit-chat with your Maker. And I think the advocate goes both ways at the same time.
Oh, yeah. I mean, St. Paul basically says, I cannot even call God Father without the Spirit. Okay? So, yeah, I mean, it does work both ways, but we're involved in a dynamic relationship here. It's not just a one-way street. Okay? I mean, and if we believe that God himself is a relationship, is rooted in relationship, then there has to be that movement. All right? Hopefully we will talk, and then we'll shut up, and then we'll listen, and, we become aware of that. So yeah, I mean, obviously two-way street.
I would add to that the word for love in Hebrew is to give. So whatever you love, you give. So if we love each other like God love us, meaning God gave us life and it keeps giving us life, we should then try in whichever way we can give life to other people.
Joe?
I was just wondering whether it helps us to think of love not as something we do, but as something we are. So it's an attitude, or it's an openness rather than something we do. So the commandments really are not, don't do this, don't do this, but you don't kill, you don't commit adultery, you don't, because that's.
I would say ultimately we should embody that.
Check.
Yeah. It's of course, and then be open and be an attitude of giving. Absolutely.
I think I had said this last time around. One of the great examples somebody said to me along the way was, if you take Paul's famous declaration of love in Corinthians, love is patient, love is kind, drop the word love and put your own name in there. Okay? And by putting your own name in that list, quote unquote, of what love is, you see that it becomes who you are. And I think that follows along with, what you're saying. I mean, unfortunately, practically all of the religions have a name for God. Christians don't. In the normal run of things, God is called God. Okay? Except in John, where he says God is love. It'd be very, very interesting if every time we use the word God, we substitute the word love, and what ramifications would that have? The same type of ramifications it would have if you used your own name to designate the elements in Paul of what love is. You know, Don is patient, Don is kind, Don is so and so and so and so. And I think that then says, okay, this is who I am, if that's what love is all about.
Okay. That's it? Okay. Thank you very much for coming. So we have an
August 7th.
August 7th. And we have the topic?
We will continue we'll do John 17, and if we have time, we'll move into the beginnings of the Passion, Death, and Resurrection. But we'll do John 17.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Oh, you want some extra copies?